So, my topic is NATO, and a brief history of it is following the carnage of World War II, the United Kingdom and France signed the Treaty of Dunkirk, promising to come to each other's defense in the case of an attack by either the Soviet Union or Germany. With realization that the Soviet Union was expanding control and power and a desire for peace, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed on April 4th, 1949, by the United States and 11 other member states. With the introduction of the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine domestically, joining an organization with democratic European countries fit perfectly into the US's foreign policy of the time. Tensions amongst NATO and the Soviet Union continued to increase, growing even higher once Stalin finally gave up with his blockade of West Berlin. NATO troops were activated for the first time in the Korean War, with NATO forces fighting alongside South Koreans' forces against the Soviet backed Northern Communists. Motivated by the integration of West Germany into NATO and also a desire to politically control Eastern Europe, in 1955 the Soviet Union and many other puppet states agreed to the Warsaw Pact. Since then, the organization has undergone change while staying committed to its original goal of safeguarding its members' well being by political and military means. In the 1990s, NATO became involved in unrest during and following the breakup of Yugoslavia and also intervened in the First Gulf War. During the 21st century, NATO has seen its role expand even further, joining in on the invasion of Iraq and in more recent years intervening in the Arab Spring and even countering piracy off the coast of Africa. For smaller states in NATO, being in the organization helps give them a sense of having a voice, as everyone is given one vote regardless of political clout. In addition, smaller states are also given military protection, as an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. For more powerful countries like the US, NATO helps promote stability and strengthens alliances with other countries. Organizations like NATO are maintained by diplomacy and the threat of potential conflict. Generally speaking, no one wants to go to war with a group of 30 countries, let alone many of them being the most powerful on Earth. So, decision making process and important offices. NATO was founded based on the principle of one country, one vote, where every country receives an equal voice regardless of political influence. The North Atlantic Council is the most powerful and important political body of the organization, being composed of permanent representatives from member states. Each state gets one vote, and for legislation to pass, there must be a unanimous vote, allowing no dissenters. The highest ranking position is the Secretary General, who's responsible for coordinating the different states in the alliance, leading NATO's international staff, chairing the meetings of the North Atlantic Council and most major committees of the alliance, and acting as a spokesperson for NATO. NATO is sectioned off into three main sections, those being a civilian structure, a military structure, and a group of organizations and agencies. The civilian structure is primarily composed of different representatives from states, while the military consists of two strategic commands and is directed by international military staff. The civilian aspect largely carries out voting on actions and consists of divisions like the political affairs and security policy, defense policy and planning, and public diplomacy division. The military structure largely consists of military-related activities and even soldiers themselves. Branches include the Allied Air Command, Allied Operations, standing NATO groups, etc. Finally, different organizations include NATO Support and Procurement Agency, Science and Technology, and Civil Emergency Planning. Membership over time and membership rules. The organization was founded in 1949 with 12 original members, those being Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the UK, and finally the US. In 1952, Greece and Turkey were jointly admitted, followed by West Germany in 1955, Spain in 82, the Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland in 99, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia in 2004, Albania and Croatia in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, and most recently, just this past year, North Macedonia. In order to potentially become a member of NATO, one must uphold democracy, including tolerating diversity. New members must be making progress toward a market economy if they do not already have one in place. The country's military force must also be under firm civilian control, and they must be good neighbors who respect sovereignty outside their border and must be working towards compatibility with NATO forces. Decisions to invite new members must take into account the ratification process in the member states, which in the U.S. requires congressional support. In order to be invited, all current states must agree, even one objector is enough for a country to not be invited. Finally, the main reason for any invitation to new members is whether their admission to NATO will strengthen the alliance and further the goals of NATO, which is to increase security and stability not only through Europe, but across the globe. Problems it solves. Overall, NATO helps combat unrest throughout the world and helps maintain peace with both its actions and presence. Since many of its neighbors are neighbors with each other and have at times been involved in conflict with each other, the fact that they are in an alliance together has led to diplomatic solutions rather than bloodshed on the streets. NATO helps prevent the formation of newer, larger alliances of countries, especially in Europe, simply because most countries in Europe are in fact NATO countries. This helps create stability and peace. Since NATO countries are aligned with each other, they have nothing to gain from attacking a fellow member except NATO forces being potentially deployed against them. In addition, NATO also helps lead to more diplomacy and less conflict. The mere threat of NATO and even other organizations like the UN from being deployed to intervene leads to more diplomacy, especially in the case of rebel groups. In the past 20 years, NATO has taken a more active role in conflicts that do not directly affect a member state, like combating piracy off the east coast of Africa. While it will be further discussed in the following section, NATO has greatly helped promote peace and reduce bloodshed since its creation. Effectiveness. While it is somewhat objective, when looking at the history of NATO and global affairs, there is a correlation between the relative peace of the past 70 years and the creation of NATO. It is hard to ignore that what was once the most violent continent in the world has remained largely peaceful since the mid-turn of the 20th century. This is despite the fact that during that same century, around 100 million people were killed in two great wars, which were started and largely fought on European soil. Furthermore, the continent is home to a countless number of ethnicities packed together on a relatively small piece of land. What the creation of NATO did is it allied the strongest nations together and brought smaller nations along for the ride, thus limiting the amount of states that could become engaged in conflict and promoting stability in the region. While it cannot be overlooked for how most of the latter part of the 20th century, the two big dogs calling the shots, the USSR and the United States, ultimately controlled global affairs, the creation of NATO led to the creation of the Warsaw Pact, thus creating two opposing major alliances. If there had been multiple competing major alliances, hypothetically speaking, like France and the US, the UK and the USSR, and Germany and Italy, there would have surely been another Great War, this time with nuclear weapons. Despite the fact that the Cold War is over, there are still two relatively dominant geopolitical superpowers, those being the US and Russia. What remains to be seen is how NATO reacts to ever-strengthening China. When taking a deep look at history, NATO has been proven to work the past 70 years. But what will happen now with China remains is its biggest test and will either make the organization or break it. One aspect of NATO that is more objectable is its commitment to democracy. According to Emory professor Dan Reether, NATO has repeatedly shown great leniency in allowing anti-democratic actions taken in member countries. This can be seen in states like Hungary and Turkey, who in the past 5 years have taken what most describe as anti-democratic measures against their own people. Despite this, they have been met with very little or no pushback at all from NATO. While NATO not promoting democracy is definitely a fair critique, promoting democracy is not what the organization's main goal is. Promoting stability in the defense of member states is, which most agree that it has done a good job for in the past 70 years. Overall, when looking closely at its history, NATO continues to show that it has been effective at what it's done, and ultimately its biggest test lies ahead. Some sources that I use for this are NATO's own website, which I use most, Dr. Gregory Pedlow, Evolution of NATO's Command Structure, NATO declines to condemn the arrests of Turkish legislators, journalists, Joyce Press Agentur, NATO Topics, the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, and NATO Command Structure. Thank you.